Hello, 7th graders. Mr. Nelson here, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about salt. Why salt? Well, on our EE trip, we're going to be going to a salt farm, and we thought you should know a little bit more about why we thought it's important for you to get to experience this really unique idea of farming salt. So first, let's talk a little bit about what we want to talk about. So here it is, the basics. We are going to be talking about what is salt, why is salt needed by humans, and it's very important. It's actually the only rock we eat as humans. We're going to talk a little bit about the historic importance of salt, how we get salt, and that's what we're going to be doing on our EE trip, and even some of the modern uses of salt. That's right, an entire video about salt. What could be cooler? Actually, this is going to be really neat. So let's begin. So first, what is salt? Well, this gets a little tricky because it depends on a little knowledge that you haven't quite been exposed to. But there's this big thing called the periodic table of the elements. And the biggest division in the periodic table of elements is between a group of atoms we call metals and a group of atoms we call nonmetals. And what salt is, and it's a very technical term dealing with acids, but the simplest version of the definition is we take a metal like sodium and combine it with a nonmetal like chlorine. Now there are many, many different salts out there, but they all have this same pattern of a metal compound and one or more nonmetals. Now, sodium chloride is one of the most abundant salts on the planet and is indeed the salt we refer to when we talk about table salt. Table salt is sodium chloride. Now, one last cool thing about sodium chloride, the salt that we are going to be dealing with before we leave this slide, and it's this. Sodium, the metal in sodium chloride, in its pure form is very dangerous and very reactive. In fact, if you throw a pure sample of sodium metal into water, it will explode. And chlorine is a toxic gas. In fact, it was the primary component in the gas weapons of World War I, chlorine gas. So, an explosive metal and a toxic gas come together and you put it on your French fries. Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, well, I still have a few more chances, but okay, that's cool. Now, why is salt important to human health? Well, especially if you are an athlete, you are constantly sweating out salts. Now, why are these salts important to your body? Well, they do a number of things. Your nerve impulses are carried up and down your nerves by the exchange of salt across the nerve membrane. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. That's unimportant, but the important thing is that your ability to blink, to reach out and grab a baseball, to think, any nerve activity is absolutely dependent on salt. Salts help us conduct energy, they regulate the fluids in your body, they help transport other important nutrients, they support proper muscle function. In fact, that's why if you start running out of salt as an athlete, you need to drink these sports drinks, which are mostly sugar and salt in addition to water, because otherwise your muscles will start cramping up if you don't have the right salt levels. They help support mental function, they help convert calories into energy, they regulate, they just do so much. In fact, the acid in your stomach, hydrochloric acid, comes from the chlorine that you extract from the salt you eat. And again, salt is the only rock humans eat. Again, all of this very cool. Now, what's the historic significance of salt? Well, salt was one of these very early minerals that humans used in all sorts of things. One of its first and most important uses is we discovered that many forms of bacteria die in the presence of salt. So if you had a cut or a wound and washed it in salt water, it would help disinfect the wound. Salt then became related to something we call purification or purifying something. Over here, we see a sumo wrestler throwing salt into the sumo ring. Have you ever wondered why they do it? Well, it's a ritual by which they purify or sanctify the ring for the bout, the wrestling bout that they're about to have. Again, salt as purifier, salt as disinfectant. Now, because salt, it's a fancy word called desiccate, but it helps remove water from systems, and bacteria are basically little cells with lots of water. The same bacteria that decompose and rot meat can be killed by salt. So we learned very early on that we could take meats like fish, ham, beef, you name it, and we could salt this meat and create jerky or other related materials, and that way we could preserve meat without refrigeration. We also found that certain vegetables, when soaked in a salt brine, could be pickled, and that's part of the secret behind delicacies like kimchi. If you don't have salt, well, you can't make kimchi. Now, salt was so important as a disinfectant, as a purifier, and as a way to preserve food, that the ancient Chinese built huge works where they would pump salty water, known as brine, all over the countryside. It was a major industry in China. In fact, the oldest records of salt production come from China. Now, the word salary is actually a Latin word meaning salt. The ancient Romans would pay their soldiers in salt. It was that important. Soldiers were willing to serve their country and risk their life for a payment in salt, which they would then bring back to their home and use for a number of purposes. Again, usually the flavoring of foods and the preservation of food. So the word salary means salt. Kind of cool, huh? Now, how do we get salt? The oldest and most basic way is by evaporating salt water. Now, the oldest technique we know, or the oldest record of collecting salt, comes from the Chinese, where they would go to a salted lake, like the Dead Sea, and they would just scrape the encrusting salt caused by evaporation from the side. Eventually, we learned to create these large, flat pools where we would let the water evaporate, and then we would just push the salt into little piles. In fact, that's exactly what we're going to do on our EE trip. We're going to see how we use this water wheel to take salt water and pump it into these large, flat evaporation ponds. And then we'll take these large brooms and push these piles of salt together so they can dry out a little bit more and be ready for the next step, which involves purifying and taking out any dirt, sand, little bits of stuff that we don't want from the salt. Now, another way we could get salt is actually by mining it. Now, the salt got trapped there when these ancient seas evaporated their water and eventually got buried by dirt and sand and became these deep rock layers of salt. Now we can dig down to these layers of salt, and here's a modern salt mine where you can see that we've dug down and just drilled out. It's a very easy process to drill out the salt, and we just collect it in these huge, huge piles for further cleaning and processing. Now, this isn't that modern. Actually, the ancient art of mining salt is very, very old. However, in one of the most elegant examples of it, this is an underground cathedral in a salt mine in a small Austrian town known as Salzburg, or a salt city. And these statues are actually carved by the miners from the salt rock itself. This entire statue is one giant rock of salt. But again, we can mine salt and bring it to the surface in large quantities, and that's where much of the world's salt comes from today. Now, what are the modern uses of salt? Well, of course, we know that we use it in food, and we use it in sports drinks as what we call an electrolyte or a salt. But we can actually take the salt and make many, many, many things out of it. The bleach that you use in laundry is a chlorine-based product, and we usually get that chlorine by breaking down salt. If you've ever been in one of these large underground tunnels and notice how the lights tend to be a little bit orange, those are sodium lights, and we get that sodium metal, again, by taking salt and separating the chlorine from the sodium. And there's just so many halide lamps. There are a number of forms of electronics that depend on, and other chemical reactions that depend on salt. But one of the new and very exciting uses of salt is, believe it or not, we might be able to use salt to generate electricity. Now, this technology is still in its infancy, but yeah, that's cool. Energy from salt. So let's review one last time. First of all, if you haven't gotten this by now, you should know that salt rocks. It's a really cool material. Again, it's the only rock that humans eat. What is salt? Well, it's a mixture of a metal and a nonmetal. The most common salt we use, sodium chloride. Why is salt needed by humans? Well, because our body has a lot of salt in it. We tend to sweat this salt out when we are athletic or when we're doing something that involves physical exertion. And if we don't replace the salt, we can get sick. The historic importance of salt, well, we used it for all these really neat purposes, especially before we had refrigeration. It was one of the best ways we had to preserve food. Kimchi is a really good example of this. It became so important that many countries chose to pay their soldiers in salt, hence the word salary or saline, which means salt. How do we get salt? Well, we can either evaporate salt water that has the salt dissolved in it. That's what we're going to do on our EE trip, or we can mine it. And the modern uses of salt, halide lamps, bleach, a number of chemical compounds, possibly even energy production. Salt continues to this day to be one of those really important compounds and is one of the reasons you get to experience it on our EE trip. I look forward to joining you sweeping up our piles of salt. Get excited, guys. This is going to be a cool trip. Bye-bye now.